I used to think that as long as there was no yelling, no hitting, a child would be fine. I believed that for many years, until one very ordinary morning when I was standing in the kitchen and saw my two daughters sitting across from each other at the breakfast table. One was asked if she slept well, the other poured herself some milk, and no one asked her anything. There was no arguing, no harsh words, just a very familiar emptiness, and I said nothing. My wife didn't do it on purpose. She was only doing what many adults do, paying more attention to the child who resembles them more. I knew that. I understood that. And because of that, I stayed silent until my stepdaughter stood up, picked up her school bag, and said a sentence I had once said myself when I was her age. "It's okay, Dad, I'm used to it." In that moment, I was no longer standing in my own kitchen. I was standing in the old kitchen of my childhood, smaller, darker, and just as silent. I remembered the feeling of having to smile so adults wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I remembered knowing that if I made myself disappear a little, everything would be more peaceful. I once swore to myself that I would never become my father, but that morning I realized a truth that was far harder to swallow. I hadn't become him. I'd already become him a long time ago, and if I kept staying silent, my daughter would grow up with the same sentence, the same wound. The only difference is that this time I would be the one standing there, watching. I grew up in a family that, from the outside, seemed to have nothing to complain about. We weren't poor. My parents worked steadily. Dinner almost always included everyone at the table. There was no yelling, no doors being slammed, no bruises hidden under long sleeves. If someone had asked me whether I was happy as a child, I probably would have nodded. I would have said yes, because I didn't know what other word to use. My parents were decent people in a way that was very common for their generation. They believed in discipline, in order, in the idea that a family shouldn't be loud in front of others. They didn't do anything that was obviously wrong. They just kept making the same choice over and over again, and that choice was rarely me. My older brother was a few years ahead of me. In some way, that decided everything. When there was only one new toy in the house, he was the one who got it first. When someone needed to represent the family, his name was the one called. When my parents were tired or didn't want to explain things, he was the one prioritized so everything could be simpler. I wasn't starved. I wasn't completely ignored. I just always came second, and after long enough, that became normal. The things my parents said sounded harmless. They even sounded gentle. "You're more understanding. Let your brother have it. He needs it more." No one said those things intending to hurt me, but children don't listen with logic. Children listen by interpreting where they stand in that world. And the way I understood those words was simple. If he needed it more, then I needed it less. If I had to be more understanding, then my feelings mattered less than other people's comfort. I don't remember anyone ever sitting down and asking me if I felt sad. Maybe because I rarely showed it. I learned very early how to swallow it. When you're praised for being well-behaved, for not causing trouble, you quickly learn that trouble is something you shouldn't create. So I trained myself not to ask, not to protest, not to expect. I felt safer when I needed nothing at all. Little by little, I became a part of the house that people only noticed when I wasn't there. I cleaned my room without being told. I ate what was left without questioning it. I nodded before I had time to think about whether I actually wanted something. No one told me I had to do that, but every time I didn't, the air in the house seemed heavier, and I hated that feeling. I hated being the reason other people felt uncomfortable. There is one moment I still remember very clearly, not because it was big, but because it taught me a lesson I've carried with me ever since. One afternoon, when my parents weren't home, something in the house broke. I don't remember exactly what it was. It might have been a cabinet door. It might have been the wall clock. I only remember the sound of it breaking and the way my heart dropped when I heard it. My brother was closer to it than I was. But when my father came home, he didn't ask. He just looked around the room and then looked at me. "What happened?" he asked. I had 1 second to tell the truth. Just 1 second. But in that second, I saw the entire house I was trying to keep peaceful. I saw the exhaustion on my father's face. I saw how everything would unravel if I spoke up. And I said, I did it. No one checked again. No one asked anything else. My father sighed and told me to be more careful. That was the end of it. The house was quiet again. And I stood there, feeling both relieved and hollow. At the time, I didn't have words for that feeling. I only knew that I had done the right thing for the family, and at the same time, I had learned that the truth was not always welcome. From moments like that, a belief system began to form inside me without anyone in the house realizing it. I believed that fairness caused trouble. I believed that silence kept people together. I believed that love wasn't about being protected, but about knowing when to endure. And most dangerously of all, I believed that if I wasn't chosen, it must be because I wasn't enough. Those beliefs didn't make me rebellious. They made me agreeable, easy to live with, easy to please, easy to overlook. Adults like children like that. But no one tells you that when you grow up, you carry those same beliefs into every other relationship. You bring them into love, into marriage, into the way you become a parent. I left that house when I was old enough, carrying the feeling that I was fine. I wasn't angry at my parents. I didn't cut contact. I just thought the past was over. I didn't realize that what truly stayed wasn't the memories, but the way I reacted whenever conflict threatened to appear. I had learned that if I stepped back, things would be smoother, and I carried that lesson into my adult life, not knowing that one day it would place my daughter in the exact position I once stood in. I carried those beliefs into my marriage without even realizing it. I met Laura at a point in my life when I was no longer looking for big emotions. I didn't want to start over with heavy promises or conversations that stretched past midnight. I just wanted someone who understood what a stable life looked like. And Laura was that kind of person. She was practical, not dreamy, not loud. Laura knew what she wanted, and more importantly, she knew what she didn't want. No drama, no arguments followed by reconciliation just to feel alive. After what I had been through in my first marriage, that calm felt like a quiet room after years of living next to a highway. Laura didn't ask much about my past. She knew I had a daughter from a previous marriage. She knew I had been married before. She knew I wasn't starting from zero. But she didn't dig. I didn't either. We chose to talk about the present, about work, about schedules, about things we could control. It was the kind of connection that made me feel safe. When we decided to live together, I believed things would work themselves out. I believed that sincerely. I didn't think I was being blindly optimistic. I thought I was being realistic. I thought that if there was no malice, no violence, no yelling, then a family would naturally find its balance. I had lived my entire childhood by that belief, and no one had ever challenged it. Our new family formed in a very ordinary way. My daughter from my previous marriage, Emma, moved in with us most days of the week. Laura and I had a daughter together not long after. Sophie came into our lives gently, like a new breath. I looked at the two children in the same space and told myself that as long as I was there, things couldn't go too far. I wasn't naive enough to think everything would be perfect. I knew that merging two worlds was never simple. I just believed that if something was wrong, I would notice in time, that if something felt off, I would step in and adjust it. I didn't realize that this very belief allowed me to postpone things just a little longer, and then a little longer again. My role in the family was very clear, even though no one ever named it. I was the mediator, the one who softened things, the one who found a way to say something that made both sides nod. I was used to it, I was good at it, and I was praised for it. Laura often said I was thoughtful, accommodating. I heard those words as compliments. I didn't realize that behind that accommodation, an old habit was quietly at work. When there were small differences in how the children were raised, I chose to deal with them later. When Laura made quick decisions about something involving the kids, I told myself there was no need to argue right away. When I felt something was uneven, I told myself I was probably being too sensitive, that every family had imperfections, and that bringing up those differences would only make everyone more tired. I didn't do this because I didn't care. I did it because I cared too much about peace. I was used to believing that if I endured just a little more, things would adjust on their own. That time would do the rest. That children would grow up, understand, and forget. I had forgotten that children don't forget the things that shape how they see their own worth. In that new family, I rarely took a clear side. I thought I was being fair. I thought I was maintaining balance. But most of the time, I was simply avoiding having to choose. And not choosing, in some situations, is itself a choice. I noticed very small differences in daily life, but they were small enough for me to ignore. the way a question was asked of one child but not the other, the way a need was met more quickly because it was more convenient. I saw them, acknowledged them, and then placed them on a list of things that didn't need to be dealt with right away. I didn't realize that list was growing longer every day. I still believed I was a good father. I was present. I went to parent-teacher meetings. I knew my children's schedules. I thought that was enough. I didn't realize that sometimes what a child needs isn't general presence, but someone willing to step in when fairness is being eroded, even just a little. The early years of our new family passed fairly smoothly. There were no major crises, no moment that forced me to stop and look directly at what was happening. And that very smoothness reassured me. I thought I had escaped my past. I thought I had built a different life. I didn't realize that what is never named will always find a way to return, just in a form that feels more acceptable. I carried into this marriage all the beliefs I had learned as a child, that conflict should be softened, that fairness can wait, that love sometimes means staying silent. I didn't know that those very beliefs were planting the seeds of a repetition I would only recognize when it was no longer just my story anymore. At first, everything unfolded in a way that was hard to point at directly. There was no single moment big enough for me to stop and say, "Here it is. This is the problem." There were only small differences repeating themselves until they began to blend into the rhythm of everyday life. And when something becomes routine, it is rarely seen as wrong. The household schedule was always arranged in the most convenient way. Convenient for the adults. Convenient for a fast-paced life. Sophie had a fixed bedtime, fixed meal times, a routine that was regularly reminded and reinforced. Emma was more flexible. Flexible in the sense that she adapted on her own. If dinner was late, she reheated it herself. If everyone was busy, she figured things out on her own. I saw that and told myself that Emma was older, that she could handle it. I forgot that many children who can handle it do so, not because they want to, but because no one asks whether they need help. Attention flowed just as naturally. Sophie was asked about her day at school, about what made her happy, about the small things children usually talk about. Emma sat there too, eating more slowly, speaking less. No one told her to be quiet. No one stopped her from talking. But when you are not asked, you learn not to interrupt. I had learned that lesson very early, and I was watching it repeat itself. Only this time, I was sitting on the other side of the table. The way people spoke in the house was different as well. With Sophie, the tone was softer, more patient. With Emma, it was quicker, shorter, as if she already knew everything. "You can do it yourself. You're older now." Those sentences were spoken without ill intent, but I began to notice that they were always said to the same child, and each time an invisible boundary was drawn a little more clearly. I didn't stand up and object, not because I didn't see it, but because I saw it and chose to explain it away. I told myself that at least she was safe, at least she wasn't abandoned, at least she had a roof over her head, food to eat, a school to go to. I compared her situation to worse ones, and by doing that, I softened the discomfort inside me. I told myself that without malice, it couldn't be called unfair, that favoritism was just a heavy word for very ordinary differences. Laura didn't do anything that forced me to stop immediately. She loved her daughter. That was obvious, and I understood that instinct. I never doubted her love for Sophie. I just didn't question what that love was unintentionally taking away from Emma, and because I didn't ask, no one else did either. Oh, some evenings I passed by Emma's room and saw her doing her homework alone, the door half closed, the yellow light on, no voice calling for help. I stood there for a few seconds, about to step in, then turned away. I told myself she needed space, that she liked being independent, that if she needed something, she would say so. I forgot that children only speak up when they believe someone will listen. Gradually, Emma spoke less, not in any sudden way, just shorter answers, fewer details, less emotion. When asked, she always said, "It's fine." I heard that sentence and felt a familiarity that was almost frightening, because it was the same sentence I had used for years to end conversations I didn't want to continue. Emma asked for less, requested less, caused less trouble. She didn't compete, didn't complain, didn't compare, and because of that, she was very easy to overlook. Not because anyone wanted to overlook her, but because no one felt the need to stop. I saw that silence and called it maturity. I didn't realize it was a child shrinking herself to fit into a space that had never been made for her. Sometimes I wondered whether, if Emma cried more, demanded more, people would notice her more. Then I scolded myself for thinking that. I didn't want her to have to be loud to be seen. I just didn't know how to make her silence count as a signal rather than an agreement. The tension inside me didn't come like a storm. It came like a dull ache, persistent, mild enough to ignore, stubborn enough not to disappear. Each time I noticed a small difference, I placed it in the same place in my mind where I had stored similar things as a child. A place I labeled not worth making a big deal out of. A place I had learned to live with. But there was one thing I couldn't deny. Emma was learning very quickly how not to need anyone. And every time I saw her manage on her own, part of me felt relieved. Relieved because I didn't have to confront anything. Relieved because everything stayed calm. And right after that came a sense of shame I didn't name, because I knew exactly where that feeling came from. I had been that child once, and I knew the price of becoming that child is never paid immediately. There were no arguments, no tears, no accusations, just a family functioning smoothly in a way that slowly erased one child from view. And I, who had once sworn I would never let that happen, was standing there, calling it adaptation. The tension wasn't about whether Laura loved Emma or not. The tension was whether I dared to admit that love, left unchecked, can still cause harm, and that every time I chose silence to keep the peace, I was laying another brick on the same path I had walked all through my own childhood. That moment did not come during an argument. There were no tears, no accusations. It came on a very ordinary afternoon, in the way the most important moments in life often do. So light you almost miss them, yet so heavy you can never forget them. Emma was standing in the kitchen, her backpack at her feet. She asked if I could drive her to a friend's house. I looked at the clock, ran through my schedule in my head, and said that Dad was busy today. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't a priority. I said it in a very familiar tone, the tone of someone who believes he is being reasonable. Emma nodded, no hesitation, no pleading, no disappointment showing on her face. She just said, "It's okay, Dad. I'm used to it." The sentence wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was like something hitting the floor, making a sound only I could hear. I stood still. Emma had already turned away, as if the conversation was over, but inside me, something had just opened that I had been trying to keep sealed for many years. I had said that exact sentence before, not a single word different. I remember it clearly. I was 10 years old, standing in the old kitchen of my parents' house. The floor was cold. The fluorescent light hummed softly. I asked my mother if I could go along on a trip when I already knew the answer. And when she said no, I smiled, just like Emma had, and said that I was used to it. I remember my eyes at that moment, not angry, not sad in a loud way, just an early acceptance, as if I had understood the rules of the game for a long time and no longer saw a reason to resist. I remember that feeling so vividly that I had to grip the kitchen counter in the present to keep my balance. 2 kitchens, 30 years. The same sentence, the same look. What frightened me was not that Emma said those words. It was how she said them. Calm, certain, like something practiced long enough to stop hurting. I know that feeling. I have lived with it my entire life. It doesn't knock you down right away. It just teaches you how to make yourself smaller so you fit into other people's expectations. I stood there and realized that all this time I hadn't just been seeing my past. I had been recreating it, not through malice, not through obvious actions, but through a very familiar silence, through avoiding difficult conversations, through the belief that if nothing was made into a big deal, everything would be fine. I had always thought I was different from my parents, that I understood emotions better, that I was more present, and maybe I was, to some extent. But I had never asked myself a more important question. Was I willing to do what they had never done? Was I willing to break the peace to protect a child? The answer arrived together with a truth I could no longer avoid. I did not marry someone like my mother. Laura is not like her in any obvious way, but I am becoming my father, not in personality, not in words, but in the way I choose adult comfort over a child's fairness. That realization did not come like a lightning strike. It came like turning on the light in a dark room. Everything had been there all along. I just hadn't seen it. I saw again all the moments I had ignored, the times I noticed something unequal and told myself it wasn't big enough yet, the times I chose to speak later instead of now, the times I believed that time would fix what people were too afraid to face. I realized that if I continued like this, Emma would not grow up with memories of a father who stood up. She would grow up with memories of a father who saw, who understood, and still chose silence. And that is the memory I carry of my own father, not because he was bad, but because he did nothing when he should have. That moment gave me no way back. Once you see the loop, you cannot pretend it doesn't exist. I knew that from the moment Emma said those words, every silence of mine afterward would be a decision, not an unconscious avoidance anymore. I didn't say anything to Emma then. I didn't hug her. I didn't apologize. I didn't promise anything. Not because I felt nothing, but because I understood that this moment didn't need words. It needed action. And I knew that from that point on, I could no longer hide behind reasonable explanations. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after Emma had left. I looked around as if I were looking back at a life I thought I had built carefully. I realized that the most dangerous thing is not that we repeat our parents' mistakes. The most dangerous thing is doing so while believing we are different. And in that quiet moment, I understood that if I didn't change, the sentence, "I'm used to it," would not just be a sentence. It would become the foundation on which my daughter builds the way she sees her own worth. And this time, I could not say that I didn't know. I did not choose that moment because it was perfect. I chose it because I knew that if I waited any longer, I would find another reason to stay silent. That evening, after both children had gone to sleep, the kitchen returned to its familiar quiet. No clattering dishes, no schedules to keep up with. Just two adults and things that had been postponed for far too long. I didn't begin with an accusation. I didn't begin with emotion either. I simply said what I had seen. I spoke slowly, not to choose elegant words, but to avoid running away from what I was saying. I said that in this house there were very small differences that repeated themselves. I talked about how schedules were arranged, about who was asked first, and who handled things on their own. I didn't use the word favoritism. I didn't say, "You're wrong." I just described it, as if I were talking about the weather over the past few days. Laura looked at me, first surprised, then quickly uncomfortable. I saw it in the way she crossed her arms, in the way she exhaled, as if preparing for a conversation she didn't want to have. "You're overreacting," she said, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly enough to draw a boundary. "She's fine. Emma's just more sensitive." I didn't respond right away. I let that sentence sit between us for a moment. I knew that feeling well, the belief that if there are no tears, if there is no strong reaction, then there is no problem. I had lived my entire childhood by that logic. I said that maybe Emma was sensitive. I didn't deny that. But I asked Laura a different question. If a child always says she's fine, does that really mean she is fine? Or does it just mean she has learned not to be a burden? Laura shook her head. She said I was reading too much into small things, that every family is different, that I was bringing my past into the present. I heard her clearly, and for the first time, I didn't treat that as a misunderstanding. I told her that yes, I was bringing my past into this, but not to place blame, to explain why I could no longer keep calling these things small. I said that I had once been a fine child myself, and I said it not as a complaint, but as a fact polished smooth by time. I was that fine child, I said. My voice didn't shake, but it wasn't firm either. I once stood in a kitchen just like this, saying I was used to it, so the adults wouldn't have to stop. Laura was silent, not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how to respond. I didn't add more details. I didn't need to. I didn't talk about my parents. I didn't retell my childhood. I just let that sentence exist, like an anchor point I had avoided for many years. She said she never intended to make Emma feel that way. I believed her. I told her I had never thought she did it on purpose. But I also said that a lack of bad intent does not mean a lack of consequences, and that in a family, unconscious actions can carry as much weight as deliberate ones. I didn't ask Laura to change immediately. I didn't make a list. I didn't set conditions. I only said one thing clearly, the one thing I had never said throughout this marriage. I will not stay silent anymore when I see Emma shrinking herself to make things more comfortable, I said. I don't need you to love her like your own child, but I need you to respect that she is here, with the same right to be seen." The kitchen fell silent again. This time, it wasn't the familiar kind of silence. It was heavier, not because of anger, but because a truth had been placed on the table that no one could easily pick up. Laura said that I was putting her in a position of being criticized. I said I wasn't looking for someone to blame. I was looking for a different way of living, a way I didn't have when I was young, and I didn't want my daughter to learn how to survive through silence the way I did. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer speaking to be understood. I was speaking to define my own boundaries. I was speaking so I could hear myself not avoiding it anymore. And whether Laura agreed or not, whether this conversation led to immediate change or not, I knew one thing had shifted. I hadn't softened things. I hadn't retreated. I hadn't chosen the sentence that would return this house to a false sense of peace. I stayed in that discomfort and let it exist. And, for me, that was a new action, one I had never been taught as a child. The conversation ended without a clear conclusion. No one apologized. No one won. But when I left the dark kitchen that night, I knew I had crossed a boundary I had always avoided before. I could no longer return to the old silence. And for the first time, I didn't see that as a threat, but as a responsibility. I did not wake up the next morning with a grand plan. There was no bullet point list, no dramatic vow, just a very simple decision. I would no longer let small moments pass by. I would not wait until things were big enough to speak up. And if that made the atmosphere in the house uncomfortable, I would stay in that discomfort. My changes were not loud. They began with very ordinary things right in front of everyone. When breakfast came down to a single piece of bread, I cut it in half. No explanation, no looking around for reactions. I placed the two halves on the table as if it were obvious. When Laura asked Sophie about her day at school, I turned to Emma and asked the same question, not to make things look balanced, but because that was how it should have been all along. There were times when Laura made quick decisions about the children, bedtimes, weekend plans, a rushed promise. Before, I would have let it go. This time, I stopped. I said, "Let's ask both of them." I said it in a normal voice, the same way you remind someone to buy more milk. But I said it clearly enough that it couldn't be ignored. Moments like that started happening more often, and with them came hesitation in the house. No one was used to being paused over things that had always been considered small. Laura began looking at me more when making decisions, not always agreeing, but no longer moving straight ahead the way she used to. I realized that when favoritism is stopped right as it happens, it loses its greatest power, the ability to pass by without being noticed. I wasn't doing these things to prove anything. I was doing them because I had understood a very uncomfortable truth. Every time I stayed silent, I was teaching Emma a lesson. And every time I spoke up, I was teaching her a different one. I couldn't control every outcome, but I could control what I allowed to exist in this house. One evening, after a long day, Laura told me she felt like she was being monitored. I heard that without becoming defensive. I told her I didn't want to control her. I just wanted to make my boundaries clear, and for the first time, I said the sentence I had avoided for many years. "I won't let my daughter learn how to disappear," I said, not loudly, not shaking. I learned that once, and I know how long it stays with you. That sentence wasn't a threat. It was a fact. And facts don't need to be shouted to carry weight. Laura didn't respond right away. She turned away, did something in the kitchen, as if she needed a few more minutes to breathe. I gave her that space. I didn't take back what I said. I didn't add anything either. The days that followed didn't become easier. There was no quick reconciliation, no perfect apology. There was tension. There were longer silences than usual. There were meals where conversation didn't flow. I realized that when you end an old loop, you also end a convenience. And that convenience, even when it's unfair, still makes many people feel safe. Emma noticed the change first, not through words, but in the way she looked up when I asked her something, in the way she hesitated for a moment before saying, "It's fine." I didn't force her to say more. I just stayed there, long enough, clearly enough, for her to know that if she did speak, someone would listen. Sophie was affected too, not in a negative way. She simply began to wait her turn, began to understand that the world does not automatically revolve around her. I didn't turn that into a lesson. I just let it happen. Children learn very quickly from what adults do. not from what they say. Laura needed time. I didn't count days. I didn't measure progress. I just continued with the actions I had chosen. Sometimes she was tired. Sometimes she was defensive. Sometimes she admitted very quietly that maybe she hadn't noticed enough. It wasn't a complete change, but it was a pause. And to me, that pause was already a difference. I also had to face myself during this time. Speaking up didn't make me feel relieved right away. It made me feel tired. It made me feel like I was causing trouble. Old feelings came back, whispering that I was disrupting the peace. I had to learn how to sit with that feeling without slipping back into old habits. I had to remind myself the peace built on a child's disappearance was not the peace I wanted to protect. The clearest consequence was that this house was no longer as smooth as before, but it was no longer running on neglect either. The loop had been interrupted, not by a dramatic blow, but by no longer feeding it day after day. I understood that ending a chain of unconscious favoritism isn't something you fix once and move on from. It's a choice that has to be repeated day after day. I don't know what our family will look like in a few years. I don't know where Laura and I will end up with these differences. I only know one thing I never knew before. I am no longer standing by and watching. And even though things aren't perfect, even though there are still uncomfortable silences, something has changed in a way that cannot be reversed. Emma no longer has to learn how to disappear to keep the peace. And for me, that is the point where every consequence becomes acceptable. The change did not come as a carefully prepared apology. It did not arrive through a long conversation or a moment of reconciliation that made everything feel better right away. It came more slowly, more quietly, and because of that, it was more real. Laura began to pause before speaking, not always correctly, not perfectly, but enough for me to notice that things which used to pass by very quickly no longer did so as easily. She asked more questions, not only to Sophie. She paid attention to Emma in small ways, waiting for her to finish a full sentence, circling back to ask for her opinion when everyone else was already close to deciding. Our family slowed down, not because anyone ordered it to, but because no one was rushing everything forward anymore. Meals lasted longer. Silences were no longer immediately filled with adult conversation. I realized that when the atmosphere no longer had to be kept smooth, it became spacious enough for a child to exist without having to shrink herself. Emma did not change right away. She was still quiet, still careful, but I noticed very small signs, ones only someone who had once been like her would recognize. The way she held my gaze a little longer when I asked her something, the way she waited an extra beat before saying, "It's fine," as if she were testing whether this time that sentence was truly necessary. One evening, when I walked Emma back to her room, she stopped at the doorway and said that I didn't need to do those things. Her voice wasn't accusing, just calmly observant, as if she were used to adults not changing for very long. I sat down at her eye level and said something I had been thinking about for a long time, but had never said out loud. "I need to do this," I said, "because no one did it for me." I didn't say anything more. I didn't recount my childhood. I didn't turn this story into a burden for her to carry. I just let her know that what was happening wasn't temporary. It wasn't an effort to keep everyone happy. It was a choice made from a very deep, very old place. Emma nodded, not the kind of nod that means a child understands everything, but the kind that belongs to a child who is beginning to believe that maybe, this time, things could be different. I don't pretend that I fixed everything. I know old habits don't disappear just because they're named. I know this family will still have moments of tension, mistakes, days when I'm tired and want to go back to the old way because it's faster. But I also know something I never knew for certain before. I chose to stand on the side of the child who needed protection, even when that meant staying in discomfort. I can't fix my own childhood. I can't go back to that old kitchen. I can't tell the 10-year-old boy that everything will be okay. But I did manage to do something else, something I once didn't believe I had the courage to do. I stopped it from becoming my daughter's childhood. And for me, that isn't a perfect ending, but it is an ending that is right enough for me to live with, day after day, without having to ask myself whether I stayed silent one more time.